Hi, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I am doing yet another edition of the Freelancer Q&A that I've been doing for the last few years. I am again doing something that I've been doing for the last few weeks, which is to, instead of my usual like FIFO, first in, first out, if you don't know what that means, burning down like my backlog of questions, sometimes going all the way back to my dead tech blogging and YouTube video days. Lately, I've been taking questions that come up more recently in the community. I figure the people that have been waiting for 3 years for an answer can probably wait another few weeks. So I've been trying to get some fresh discussion topics in here. And this is another one of those. So this week, we're going to talk about non-compete agreements for freelancers. And this is actually something that was asked of me and kind of in general in the community. So I grabbed the text of it and I'm going to summarize it and take a little bit of liberties to shorten because it was a longer form question. But the gist is this week, after a lot of discussion, I agreed on a project with a client and they sent over their contract. It contains a non-compete clause for providing identical or similar service to what I would be doing for them. As regards to their competition for a period of 5 years. So basically, the company sent over this non-compete agreement for this person to sign, and it says you can't do anything similar to what you're doing for us for anyone that we construe as a competitor for the next 5 years. Until now, my clients haven't asked for something like this. Are non-competes for freelancer developers a thing? How would you go about reasoning about it? How much more should you charge, or what other concessions should you ask for is the question. So again, to summarize, non-compete for 5 years for anyone that this business construes as a competitor. And the question is essentially, how do you handle this? Like, what are some options? Is this common? What should I do? How should I argue through it? And I did address this in the community, which you can join if you're so inclined and you're watching this somewhere externally. And we do discuss things of this nature, but I'll also provide this video response. So whenever this type of video comes up, I give this disclaimer just in case I guess I could be sued or something. I am not a lawyer. Please do not interpret what I'm saying here as legal advice. I generally record answers to questions like this, essentially relaying what I would do in a similar position. And because I am not a lawyer, I might do something stupid or risky or obtuse. I don't know. But, I do have a good bit of business experience and I've certainly navigated non-compete agreements in the past. So just take this for what it is, which is me talking about what I, Eric, would do in this position. That's going to be the advice portion. What I want to do first is give you the context of how I tend to view non-compete agreements so you understand the nature of my personal bias on the topic and can listen or tune me out accordingly. I am generally not a fan of non-compete agreements. This is, in general, I don't think we ever ask employees to sign them or contractors or anybody coming into our community. I have no interest in trying to put restrictions on who anyone working for me can work for. I don't believe in that. On the other side of it, if I'm asked to sign non-competes over the course of my career, I don't like them. I try to get out of them. So that's kind of the bias that I have. I will also say, in my experience, non-competes are largely unenforceable. So it's pretty frequent for an employer, for instance, when you're an employee, to bring you on and have you sign an employment contract with a sometimes draconian non-compete agreement. And my understanding, having talked to lawyers about the topic and people in HR, is that usually as written, these things are unenforceable. A lot of them will almost like try to make it so that you can't like ever work for anyone for the rest of your life. And obviously no court is going to prevent you from earning a living. So it is fairly typical for non-competes to be unenforceable as written, that the courts simply would not uphold them. And even beyond that, they're unlikely to be pursued. So if you are going to work for Giganticorp and you sign an employment agreement, and then later you go work for one of Giganticorp's competitors 6 months later, odds are Gigantic Corp is not even going to notice that. If they do, they're probably not going to queue up the machine to sue you, an individual who is mostly judgment proof, meaning it's not really worth their legal fees to sue you. They're probably not going to bother doing that. They might send you some nasty grams or something. I don't really know, but it is unlikely that they are going to take this contract and then take you to court and somehow sue you for working a 9 to 5 job for some other company, or in this case, working as a freelancer for some other company. So why do they do this? If it's largely unenforceable, if it's usually overly prescriptive, et cetera, it's more to prevent you from working for competitors by scaring you than it is to prevent you from working for competitors via legal recourse. So they want to scare the crap out of you at the prospect of doing so that you won't, rather than they anticipate you doing so and are going to sue you or file an injunction or something. Now, I do want to be clear before I get into the advice of how to handle this. That is not a guarantee. So if you go and you sign a non-compete agreement and then later you violate that agreement, I am not telling you that there's no chance you'll be taken up legally in some fashion. I'm not saying that you won't get a letter of injunction or a nastygram or even a lawsuit. It could happen. And in some sense, given that you signed a contract, they would be within their right to do so unless the court found it unenforceable. So there is a small risk, but it has been my experience from both sides of the aisle and understanding these things that it's really more about prevention than it is about recourse in the event of you competing against a non-compete. So bear that in mind throughout the whole process of negotiating through non-compete agreements as a freelancer. So let's talk about how to handle this. The first thing that I would suggest doing right out of the gate, because there's no downside to this, is you are in this situation, you receive, you've gone through a sales process, they want to enlist you as a freelancer, enlist your services, everything sounds good, you've agreed on rate and so on and so forth. Oh, by the way, could you sign our contract? And then, oh, by the way, it contains this non-compete agreement. The very first thing that I would bear in mind is, as a freelancer, you are a business owner, and as a business owner entering into a contract, it is not only appropriate for you to strike and mark up contracts and change them. I would say it's expected. A company should be surprised if you, or should be surprised if you never do this. Like if we're sending out contract agreements to like a vendor or something, like Hit Subscribe is, we're engaging with a vendor and we say, hey, we want you to sign this particular contract, dear vendor. I would be surprised if the vendor didn't come back with questions or markups or whatever. I wouldn't expect the vendor to just sign any contract that I handed to them with no questions asked. Now, some of this is going to have to do with leverage. Are we a big account for this vendor? Are we no big deal for them, et cetera? And that might be what you're feeling as a freelancer. Hey, I'm kind of a small fish. This is a plum gig. It's a big contract. Don't let that dissuade you from marking up the contract. You are entirely within your rights to do so. I have done that throughout my career. I couldn't even begin to count how many contracts I've marked up. I've done this as a freelancer. I've done this as an employee. I do this all the time for Hit Subscribe. If the contract isn't sort of off the rails enough to send to an attorney, I'll just go through and strike common clauses that we see but won't sign. So by all means, you want to start out by marking up the contract. And the thing that I would suggest doing to start with is go in and just strike all of the stuff about a non-compete in the contract. So just everything about the non-compete. It's probably going to be in a clause in the contract unless it's its own standalone contract. And if it's a clause in that contract, what you want to do is you probably have the contract in Microsoft Word. So go into suggesting changes mode and delete it. And what you want is, because you're in suggesting changes mode, when you delete it, it will show up as a red line through it. That's what you want to send over, suggesting changes mode. Maybe you just write a comment in there saying, I don't sign non-competes, and send that back over, because they're either going to review it or they're going to send it to their lawyers who will want to view it in that review pane anyway. So strike the contract and then send it over, and send it over in a way that, as if you struck non-compete agreements all the time. So send over something breezy like, hey, thanks for sending. Anyway, this looks great. I just struck the part about a non-compete. I don't do non-competes. Let me know what you think, and looking forward to getting started. So what you want to do is position this as, oh, of course I would strike this non-compete. I'm sure you're expecting that. Yeah, I don't do non-competes. Strike these all the time. I'm sure people strike them for you all the time. Almost, hey, I get that you asked, but yeah, it's kind of silly. Nobody does this. So you want to adopt that posture. Just, of course I'm striking this. Of course you're going to agree to it. It's sort of crazy. I can't fault you for trying, but yeah, let's get serious. Not doing a non-compete. That's the attitude you want to adopt and send it back over. Now, if they're going to defer to their outside counsel, that's not going to fly a lot of times. They're not just going to be like, oh, he seems confident, so I guess we're not doing a non-compete. But if they're kind of on the fence, they may agree to it. If they don't really want to lose out on the prospect of working with you, they might just, I don't know, ignore the lawyer's advice or whatever. Like, it might work. What's a lot more likely is that their lawyer will view that as the opening salvo in some kind of negotiation. So, no, we need a non-compete, but why don't you tell us what's wrong with it? Is it for too long of a period of time? Is it too broad in terms of the companies that we're preventing you from working with? Like, work with us here. What I would want to negotiate to, if I were you, is maybe a list of competitors that they don't want you working for, and maybe a shorter period of time or something, because it can be fair to sign a non-compete. If they're bringing you in to work on something that's sort of a competitive differentiator for them, and they're going to expose to you their secret sauce, it would be pretty reasonable for them to say, hey, we don't want you going to work for direct competitor A, B, or C with this knowledge for at least a year or two or something like that. Like, that is fair for them to ask. I don't begrudge them that. I really don't like the kind of non-competes that are essentially open-ended, like you can't work for anyone in this region, or you can't work for anyone that, commissions software or something, and companies will do that. But if you can get them to be specific and the scope of that non-compete would genuinely hurt them, then that's fair. So what I would be looking for here, if they agree to your strike, great. But what's more likely is that you're going to be able to go back and forth and get them to list out a few companies, maybe knock that term of this agreement down from 5 years to something not crazy like a year, et cetera. And usually, my experience in working with lawyers to define contracts that hit subscribe uses, as well as, from the other side of the aisle in negotiating, their lawyers are incented to make the agreement that they start with as company favoring as humanly possible. So they're going to say, yeah, for 5 years, you can't work for anyone else on planet Earth because that could hurt us. And they're not doing that because they expect you to sign it. They're doing that to kind of plant the flag. It's an anchoring technique so that you're negotiating your way back from there instead of starting with no non-compete and them trying to like push it to where there is some non-compete. So that's how I would play it. Now, the question that stems from here is how much ground do they give? And at this point, do you find it acceptable? So this negotiation will happen. They'll agree to make it less restrictive to some degree, or maybe they won't, or whatever. What do you do next? So assuming they don't completely capitulate on the subject, you have to look at this and say, wherever they've landed, final offer on the non-compete, do I consider this a deal breaker? And if you're talking about anything that lasts for 5 years, I would probably consider this a deal breaker, at least me personally. Likewise, if they just, leave it as anyone that they could construe to be a competitor, if they don't get specific about who they're talking about, I would also probably walk away from that. For me, it wouldn't be because I was afraid of getting sued. It would more be because of what that signified about the relationship, which is they viewed themselves as in a position to extract unreasonable concessions from you. They view you as kind of a subordinate partner in the relationship. I wouldn't want to start out that way. So I'd say, look, no, I'm not going to do this. Good luck. That's one option. Another option that could reopen negotiations would be one that I don't know if I mentioned it when reading this, I might have skipped over it, but the original poster of this content did ask about the idea of negotiating a higher rate or something like that with the contract. I think that's entirely fair. So if they say, no, we really want to include this non-compete for 5 years. And we want to, have it be fairly broad, that it's any company that's in agriculture at all, let's say. What you can do is say, okay, fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to charge you $50,000 for the project. And then I'm going to tack on a $10,000 exclusivity kicker, like an extra fee. And my reasoning here is you're essentially making my marketing and prospecting harder for the next 5 years. So I think it's fair for me to bake in $2,000 a year of cost, simply because I'm going to have to work that much harder to sell services in the future. I'm a big believer in aligning incentives. So I think that's a fair thing to come back with. Working with you is going to make it harder for me to apply my trade. So I'm going to charge you a premium and feed that back into my own cost structure to do sales, marketing, and prospecting. Now, when you do that, they might either say, no, I'm not paying that. That's silly. Or they might say, yeah, fair enough. Maybe the non-compete is extremely important to them, but you're also valuable. So it's a nice mutual concession way out. They still get their non-compete, but they're willing to pay a premium to work with you. And to me, that's a show of good faith. So that is one thing that could happen, is you could try charging them more. I wouldn't raise your rate for it personally. I would try to structure it in a way where, maybe you just say, like, I'm going to have a trailing retainer on this for the next 5 years. So you pay me $300 a month for the next 5 years, for as long as you want me not to compete. That kind of relationship where they're just paying you for nothing for 5 years is kind of hard to swallow. That people don't like to agree to that. So you would probably have better luck structuring it as a one-time service fee into your engagement. So that would probably reopen the negotiations. And if that doesn't work, if they say no, or they bargain you down, you have to think about what you want to do next. And again, most likely I would say walk away. So to recap what's happened up to this point, my advice would be to start out striking the non-compete, go back and forth a little. And then if they land somewhere you're not comfortable with, to say, listen, I'm not comfortable with that because it's going to make my sales, marketing, and prospecting more expensive for the next few years. But what I can do is bake in a higher rate structure that kind of compensates me for that difficulty, relatively speaking. And if you're willing to pay that, then okay. There's a good chance they'll say no to that because it's not really standard. And if they do, then the last thing you could think about is just going along with the non-compete. And then after the engagement, you'll have to decide if you want to violate the non-compete or not. I mean, you could violate it and they probably wouldn't know. And if they did, they probably wouldn't come after. But again, there's risk there. You could agree to the engagement and then just abide by the non-compete. And you would have to decide how much of a imposition that would really be on your ability to conduct business in the future. It might not be at all. I don't know. Another thing that just struck me, I didn't mention this in the conversation in the community, but if you are incorporated as an entity and you're signing as that entity, in theory, and you would really want to ask a lawyer about this in your jurisdiction, but in theory, you could sign as an officer of that business entity, Acme Inc., and then later incorporate under Beta Inc. and do business not under the auspices of that non-compete. That might be entirely doable. You would want to consult an attorney, though I might be out over my skis on that recommendation. It strikes me as the kind of thing that might be possible, but in your jurisdiction, I'm probably not the first person that's figured out a workaround like that. So there may be laws preventing that kind of thing, but it's something to look into if you want to get creative. So, it's really all about your perception of risk and managing risk. If you want to agree to it and defy it, if you want to agree to it and just abide by it, if you want to try to play a game, like I mentioned, with two different companies or something, all of those are options that you have. You would just have to think, how much risk can I absorb? How bold am I, et cetera. So that is kind of how I would handle it. Me personally, I would not get into the business. I'm pretty risk averse, so I wouldn't sign a contract and then later go violate it. I would just not sign that contract personally. And it's not so much because I would be scared of legal action. As an aside, I remember they're not non-competes, but at a couple of different companies I worked for, there were tuition reimbursement agreements where they had a benefit where they would help pay for my master's degree. And the catch was, if I left within 2 years of getting that reimbursement, I had to pay it back. I, from two different companies, left those companies, even though I should theoretically have had to pay that money back, and they never came after me for it. It just didn't happen. So it is fairly common, I think, for these things to be a lot of sound and fury up front and not enforced later. But unlike the situation with the tuition reimbursement, where I left the job prepared to pay it back and they just didn't happen to come after me, I don't think I would want to personally be on the hook for anything that could be a legal action where they, come after my company, or maybe even personal assets as a breach of contract. But that's me. Um, but a bigger reason for it is what I was saying earlier about not liking the tenor of that relationship. If they're trying to force you to sign a rather draconian non-compete agreement, and you are reasonably pushing back and saying, "Whoa, this is a lot," and their take on that is, whatever, sign it or don't," they don't really view that as a partnership, and that isn't how I would want the relationship to start, with me doing some good faith negotiation and saying, "Look, I have a justifiable problem with that," and then saying, "I don't care, do it anyway." I wouldn't want that partnership. So that is my take. Let me leave you with some advice, because this will not be the last time this sort of thing comes up. I would do two things in order of priority. Number one, I would look at any contractor agreements that you've been asked to sign in the past and think about the nature of clauses that you're not comfortable signing. So that might be non-compete agreements. It might be, clauses about a minimum number of hours that you need to work. Sometimes contractor agreements will require that you carry certain kinds of insurance. So I would have maybe a folder where you're making notes. And anytime you have a contract presented to you and it has things in it that you consider objectionable, I would document that for future reference. And that will start to grow. And what will happen, and this is something Hit Subscribe has built up under my direction over the years, we actually have, like, if a client says, "Sure, I'll work with you, but I want you to sign this contract or agreement we actually send over, when they say something like that, "Here are a list of the most common causes that we see and will strike." So you can save your time and energy, and if you're going to out of house counsel, you can save some expense. If you're going to send over an agreement with A, B, C, D, or E, we won't sign it. So bear that in mind up front. That saves both parties some negotiating angst, but it also is a good look during your sales process, because it suggests you're dealing with this kind of stuff all the time. It lends you an air of authority, where they might be saying, "Oh, you see this and strike it all the time. Maybe it is a little bit unreasonable for me to ask that." So that's something that you can do as you get more at bats with contract negotiation, is just have a standard list of things that you won't agree to. You can take it one step further and actually have your own services contract. That can also be a good way to add structure. One of the things that I'm most fond of saying, I didn't come up with this, I stole it from somewhere, but I can't remember who said this originally. But it's essentially, whether it's sales or any kind of negotiation with clients, somebody is going to supply structure. It's either going to be you or them. And if you're not doing it, they will. So this is an instance of that. We have this contract we asked everybody to sign. If, when you're talking to them early in the sales conversation, you're talking about your services contract, they might later come back and say, "Whoa, no, we have our own." But you have planted the flag first. "I have a services contract." That might be sufficient. There are some companies out there that just want some kind of contract, and they might actually take yours and send it over to their legal and have their legal mark yours up. Like, that can actually work. So over the long haul, having your own contract can work in a number of ways. They might sign it. You might send it over and have their legal compare the two side by side, so that their legal can see what your requirements are. And it generally speaks to you being experienced and knowing what you're doing. Outsourcing as much work to their legal as possible is good, because number one, it saves you expenses. But number two, their legal then starts to charge them for all of this stuff. And one of the main things you want to do in contract negotiation is have your client start to view their own lawyers as the enemy rather than you. So you're saying, "Here's my service contract. The client, who's probably an engineering manager that wants to work with you, is excited to get going. They view their legal as something of a like compliance concern that is annoying. And the more their legal is coming back and running up fees and going back and forth and stuff, the more annoyed they're going to get with their own legal. And then you're not the bad guy, their legal is. So having a contract, having a series of things that you normally strike, all feeds into that dynamic. That's some more like intermediate to advanced contract negotiation. So I'll wrap it there. This is definitely a subject I could go on about at length because I am, again, not a fan of non-competes and I have tons of experience with them. So hopefully that helps both in the most tactical sense and those last bits of advice for, more generally how to handle this sort of thing. And I will catch you next time.